Hello everyone, my name's Jem. I am the editor of Journal Resources. It's so great to have so many of you here joining us live. I can see a couple more people are kind of trickling in. We're really excited to be running this session over the next hour. It's great to have you all here. This is our second event that we've done with On Road, so we're really keen to kind of show you all the fantastic kind of work that they're doing and kind of how you can incorporate that within your journalism, and hopefully this will also be the first of many. So please do check out what they're doing and do kind of really use this as an opportunity to kind of explore and ask questions and learn as much as you want to get from it. I'm going to pass over to, I think, Jamie now, right, who will be able to tell you a little bit more about On Road.
Thanks so much, Jem, and it's wonderful to be back with the Journal Resources people. Your audience is so engaged and we love that so much. So thank you for coming along today. I'm Jamie. I'm the Interactions Manager at On Road Media, which will make a little bit more sense in a minute when I tell you what an interaction is. But for now, we just thought we would get you to do, just so that we can get the chat box nice and hot and alive, is if you could let us know your name, who you write for, if you're a freelancer, and tell us where you're based. That would be fab. A great chance to let everyone else know who you are as well in there. So I'm sure those will start rolling in a minute. And whilst they do, I'll explain a little bit about who we at On Road are. I'm helped tonight by a couple of On Road fellows as well, who are going to stick up the slides as I chat. So On Road Media, we're a charity that changes hearts and minds about misrepresented social issues. So the way that we do that is we bring together people like yourself, amazing people like yourself, with people with direct lived experience. And the reason we do that is because we find that like lived experience is like almost a silver bullet in so many different things. But when it comes to writing with authenticity, bringing the people that you're writing about into the storytelling is so important. So we do that by kind of like doing lots of research and working with people with lived experience to enable that, before then kind of designing and creating kind of messaging guides and also kind of sessions that kind of help people understand the kind of lived experience. And then ultimately, we do this all in a way that brings people like yourself together with the people that you're writing about so that you can create stories that are really amazing. So like our sessions that we call interactions, you might kind of better understand them as briefings or focus groups or kind of media training. But unlike traditional media training sessions, they're like entirely collaborative in nature. And so they're really great for like workshopping scripts, working out features, coming up with content ideas, news stories. And we do this with 10 years of experience, all the major broadcasters. And a really great example of our work came out just last week, and it's been on the top trending bar of Netflix. We massively helped share with the Angles project, which is what you're here to hear about tonight, the Jimmy Savile, A British Horror Story. And what we did there was we entirely shifted the focus from kind of trauma and difficult stories onto the system, which enabled characters like Savile to play out. And so it's a really good example, if you haven't seen, of how kind of reporting with authenticity by bringing people with lived experience into that storytelling is so deliverable and possible. So a little bit about how tonight's going to work. So a couple of ground rules, basically. You'll all have done many of these, I'm sure, by now, several years into what feels like a never-ending thing. But anyway, look, if you have background noises, then stay on mute. We really do, however, encourage you to get into that comment box and chat, and it's so good to meet so many of you in the chat boxes. Thank you for those. I think it's really important whenever you're doing any kind of training session, particularly around kind of like marginalized and unrepresented groups, to recognize that we all come from different backgrounds and experiences. So we at the team On Road, we totally know that, and we know that you'll be in the same. Equally, it's really important because of that we respect and listen to each other, and recognize that it's okay to learn and make mistakes. And so that's the space that we're going to do. So as well as today's kind of chat that we're going to talk to you, there's an opportunity to kind of go into breakout rooms and meet people with direct experience from our network. So when you do that, it's really important for you to know that although the first half of the session is going to be publicly available, the second half, when we do in breakout rooms, is off the record, it's on background. And at that point, it'd be really important to respect boundaries and confidentiality of anything that's shared there. Finally, look after yourself and take breaks. I definitely have some squash in a Toy Story cup over there. So make sure that you kind of keep hydrated this evening. So here's the roadmap for how this is going to work. I'm going to stop talking in a minute because I'm the least interesting person in the room. I'm just going to steward us through the evening. We're going to jump into a fireside chat led by a member of our network, Tanaka. And then we're going to hear a little bit about media tips from the wonderful Jo Healey before delving into those breakout rooms where you'll get to ask questions and kind of meet people from our network. And then we'll close, and we're going to finish on time because finishing on time is important and everyone has an evening to get to. So just one final last bit of groundwork. Tonight's kind of evening is using our experience and knowledge with our Angles project. So Angles brings people with lived experience of sexual and domestic abuse together with media professionals like you to inspire coverage and a better understanding of the issues. And we are going to be talking a lot about something covered in journalism.co.uk and Jo Healey's media tips. So we're going to pop the link of that into the chat box throughout, and it'll be part of your resource pack at the end of the night. But just to know, everything that we're going to talk about tonight, you can pull from this article, which we'll send you shortly. So now for some introductions. We get to the content, which is the exciting bit. We are joined tonight by Jo Healey, a senior journalist and specialist trainer in trauma reporting. So it's Jo's tips that we're going to be talking about. And Jo's covered hundreds of people's painful stories across 30 years of kind of years as a journalist, lots of work with newspapers, radio, and also lots of BBC. And she's also the author of Trauma Reporting, a journalist guide to covering sensitive stories, and trains journalists internationally and how we best work with victims, survivors, and vulnerable interviewees. And recently authored UNESCO's document on safety of journalists covering trauma and distress with on Do Not Harm. We're also joined by Tanaka Nishi, who is a writer, performer, and storyteller, an all-round lovely person. He's worked with issues around surrounding masculinity and trauma, and has been produced on screen by the BBC and stages nationwide. He's the author of This Is How It Happens, a play about male survivors of sexual violence, and Off West End Award-nominated Boys Don't, which he co-wrote and performed in partnership with Paper Tail Productions and Half Moon Theatre. Tanaka is a trustee for Survivors UK, a charity supporting male and non-binary survivors of sexual violence in London and across the UK. And his first book, Sons and Authors on Loving Male Survivors, a new look at male survivors as fathers, husbands, sons, and friends, will be published in late 2022 by 404 Inc. Sorry. So obviously amazing set of experience there. And finally, another superstar in this space, Michelle Rawlins, who is an award-winning journalist, author, ghostwriter, and copywriter with 25 years of experience working for newspapers, magazines, online publications. And Michelle's built a long and consistent career from interviewing people from all walks of life and turning their words into print for traditional media and digital platforms. So all around amazing panel. And at this point, I will hand over to Tanaka, who's going to lead it.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, I'm really excited about this. This is kind of one of those dream gigs where you just get to have a chat with really clever people, which is really, really lovely. So I think I'll jump right in. Michelle, I was just wondering kind of if you could tell us a bit more about your experience reporting on some of these issues around sexual violence and domestic violence and abuse.
Absolutely. So I, as Jamie so lovely explained to you all, I've been a journalist for over 25 years, and I specialised very early on in my career in real life journalism. And when you are talking about real life, it's often women's magazines, feature desks for newspapers, chat shows, TV programmes, and my role was to often talk to people who had been affected by sexual abuse, men, women, non-binary people, and the impact that had on them, not only in the instant, in the moment, but for the rest of their lives, and how they dealt with what happened to them, and how they either moved forward, coped, or had a very tricky time of it. Mm-hmm. So I suppose when I talk about interviewing people, it's really important that we say people and we don't say case studies, because it's very easy in journalism to talk about the people you're interviewing as case studies. But what's more important is to accept that they are people with lived experiences, and that this isn't just a story, it's their lives. And I think having that as a base level of empathy and understanding and respect will take you a long way.
I was wondering, because I think it's so rare to have this kind of long-term experience. And I was just wondering if you could say something about kind of what's changed over, or what the direction of travel has been that you've seen kind of over the past few years, but more broadly as well.
Definitely. I mean, when I started out, we're talking sort of 1996, so a time ago now, and I was a very young journalist. I was straight out of my degree and then my NCTJ, which is your training journalism certificate. And straight away, I was working for press agencies and national newspapers, where you're just thrown in at the deep end. You're told to go and get that story, get the best quote, write it up. And there was no sort of training on how to deal with people who suffer any form of trauma.
Well, Michelle, you're just going a little quiet every now and again.
Oh, am I? I'll talk a bit louder. I'll talk a bit louder, that's fine. And I think what's different now, and I see it because now I teach journalism at the University of Sheffield, is that we are very keen on ensuring our students leave us with an understanding of how to deal and treat people who have suffered any form of trauma. Now, on the magazines and newspapers, things have changed too, because when I first started out, we didn't give copy approval or quote approval. But now all magazines and most feature desks will insist that actually the interviewee has a full readback, so they understand what's being written before it goes to print. And it also gives them the opportunity to check that they're happy with it and they can make any amends, which is absolutely fundamental for anybody in the media, but more so for people who suffer trauma, because they worry consistently about what's going to be written about them and are they going to be portrayed accurately and sensitively. So to be able to give them that reassurance that you will get copy approval, at the very least quote approval, it's enormous for those people. It's enormous. And I think the fact that journalists are being trained now, being trained how to interview people who've suffered from trauma, being trained how to tell them, that the journalist how to look after themselves, but also that you check in with that person afterwards, that they were okay after the interview, and just make sure that they realise you're a person too, and you don't want to cause them any pain. You want to do the best by them.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes up again and again among the Angles network is this principle of consent, and kind of particularly with this subject area, when you're working with someone who's had their consent kind of crossed or violated, kind of building a huge amount of consent into the interview process, I think for a lot of people can actually be part of recovery. And it can be it's not just about how do we stop this being a negative experience. It can also be an incredibly positive experience to tell your story. And
And that, honestly, I can't tell you how many times I've finished an interview and the interviewee has said to me, I feel like I've just been through a therapy session, because I've said my story from beginning to end in a safe environment where they feel safe, and they also feel that they can trust me because I've built that relationship and that rapport beforehand. Haven't gone in cold to an interview. It's been set up. It's been set up in a place where they feel comfortable. And they also know that after the interview that they've got those sort of safety mechanisms in place to check their article, that they haven't just met a stranger who has spent 2 or 3 hours with them, who's going to go and write their life story, and that's it, the contact's over. And many survivors I keep in touch with now after years and years. They're on my Facebook, or they text me every now and again, and that only comes by building trust. You don't get that by going into a cold interview with a cold attitude.
Yeah, like it's all in a way, it's really all about those kind of relationship building skills and kind of creating an atmosphere and a practice and a system of valuing people's agency and inviting them into that storytelling process as well.
all about respect and trust. I
Mm.
think you can do those two things and be very empathetic and sensitive to the needs involved. You are virtually there. You know, you've got to be guided, and every survivor will have different boundaries and different concerns, and you can't treat everyone the same. You have to take into account their individual needs and how having their story published is going to impact them as a person and the people around them. And I always say to any survivor of any form of abuse or violence is, you know, have you thought this through? Because once it's out there, I can't take it back.
Mm.
Can't take it back. So it's got to be right from the beginning.
Mm. Yeah.
So it's all about trust and reassurance and making sure that people realise you're a person too. And not all journalists are cut out for this type of interviewing. You know, some people are very good at interviewing politicians and very fast, hard questions. But real life journalism is a whole different technique, and it is all based around sensitivity and empathy. And one of the key things I always say to anybody when they say, I feel really nervous about the interview, I tell them to try not to think about it as an interview, but we're going to have a really long chat over several cups of tea. and because suddenly it feels like a conversation,
Yeah,
as opposed to this Q&A type scenario, which is really intimidating when you've already been violated in the worst possible way.
Yeah, it should never feel like a job interview, for sure.
No.
I think you're right. I think I do think not every journalist is cut out for this. I wanted to kind of share a story, which is we've sort of kind of covered what it feels like when this is going right, and the kind of potential in it. I have this story that I tell, and I won't name the journalist or the outlet, but it stuck with me. It was one of the really early pieces of work that I did with On Road, where I went in as a survivor who was kind of, you know, somewhat open about my experience, but not kind of massively experienced or public. And we went into a room with kind of two senior journalists, and one of them kind of sat down at the table and said, to be honest, I've been doing this for a really long time. I don't really need any help or training. I know what I'm doing, and I'm just here to meet some survivors to make content about in the future. And, you know, like that was kind of the attitude that went through the entire interaction, and, you know, kind of ask some extremely kind of invasive questions and kind of real lack of sensitivity. And then what was interesting was kind of as we moved through the session, this journalist started sharing a story about a trial that they'd reported on, and it was clear to anyone who knows kind of a bit about trauma that there was some really kind of harrowing, difficult feelings going on there. For this person, where they were really, you know, like that actually they were not okay, and they were carrying some of that secondhand trauma, which can be a massive risk if you're reporting on these issues. And yeah, I think that's something which I think is kind of slightly we haven't connected those things that kind of journalist well-being is connected to how you can take care of the people you're interviewing. And so I was just wondering, Michelle, kind of what you do to look after yourself, and kind of, yeah, where that element comes in.
Really true. And I guess there's lots of industries where this happens, whether you're in the police or the fire brigade or in the medical service. You are a human being, so it's very, very hard to disconnect and detach yourself completely. You're also a professional. So I remember one of the best pieces of advice I was given as a young journalist is, it's not your grief, it's someone else's grief. You can't hold that grief. However, I am an absolute massive softie. So it's very hard when I've interviewed someone who has been through the worst types of trauma, you know, whether it be sexual abuse, domestic violence, coercive control, losing a child, all these big things in life that, you know, fundamentally change you as a person. And you see the impact that has on them. It's very hard to just walk away and forget about that. And you can feel very upset. And, I've often got back in a car and I've had to take a big deep breath and think about what I've just listened to and what I've been told. I think the more experience you get, and the older you get, you're better at being able to compartmentalize it all. However, life experiences also change you, because when I became a parent, whenever I heard about sexual abuse against a child, that traumatized me more, because I could think, if that was my daughter or my little boy and somebody did that to them, it becomes really harrowing. What I'm really good at is going for runs. So I will often, my runs are like my therapy for everything, whether I've had a bad day at work, whether I've had a good day at work, or whether I've listened to something really traumatic. I find that just going for a run for me clears my mind of everything. Or the other thing, and I say this to all my journalism students, especially as they start getting involved in much deeper investigations, for stories that they're covering in their final year, is you must talk to other people. If you've done a traumatic interview, you have to come and talk to me, and we make sure that you're okay, because actually that you can live about with it, you can dream about it, it can stay in your mind for an awfully long time. So you must talk it through with someone you feel you can trust.
Yeah, because otherwise it goes to the next vulnerable person you're interviewing in some
and you can't carry that for them. That's not your job. You've got to be able to go into your next interview extremely professionally. Now, actually, by interviewing other people, you start to build up a level of knowledge on how to deal with the next person and the next interview. And I think very early on, this is when I realised that I couldn't call people case studies and I couldn't just call them stories, because actually they are real people and this is their life and this is their experience. So talking it through and having, like anything in life, having your own coping mechanisms, whether it be going for a run, having a glass of wine, having a cup of tea, having a bath, whatever it is, you will know it yourself, because you'll know when you feel that all that stress of the day disappear.
But recognizing that it is real and it needs some dealing with, I think
it does. And actually that is then replicated for the interviewees. They will have their own way of coping, and I will always text or phone the person I've interviewed and said, I just want to check you're okay. I know today was a really tricky time and I appreciate you talking to me. I just want to make sure you're all right. So I think checking in at each side is key.
Definitely. Awesome, thank you. We're going to go in a moment to Jo for some of the media tips, but just before we jump into that, Jo, I was wondering, it would be kind of really lovely to hear from you about some of the challenges and obstacles around doing this work, and kind of what you've encountered before we go into the tips and tricks.
Yeah, sure, Tanaka. It's lovely to meet you, and it was really interesting to hear that interview, and actually heartening to hear that in some cases students are learning this stuff, because that is generally not the rule. So it's brilliant that that's happening. Thanks for that, Michelle. So challenges and obstacles, I think there are quite a number of them. Thinking about the reporter's point of view, we want to get a good interview, we want to get a good story, and as reporters we're programmed to deliver, aren't we? That was always my sense of it when I was out on the road until very recently. We want to keep our producers and our editors happy. We feel, at times under pressure to deliver, particularly if you're freelance or you're on a short-term contract and a lot is resting on what you deliver. We can be under time pressures, meeting deadlines. We're worrying if we've got the quotes we need, we've got the shots we need, we've got all the facts accurately from maybe a fuller online piece. Will we get edited in time? Will we get it written in time? Will we write it correctly? Those are just some of the practical challenges that we can be up against. And there are challenges, of course, around what we're talking about today, working with a survivor and wanting to be a good human being as well as a good journalist, because crucially, and from all the sort of thousands of people, if you like, that have come along to the training, the overarching message that comes across from the journalists, which in a way is heartening, is they really don't want to make things worse for survivors, but equally they are under pressure, and often they flounder because they don't really know how to go about it, which is what this is kind of all about. They worry about things like, how do I listen appropriately? what does this idea of aftercare mean in real terms? What are we talking about there? What if I say the wrong thing? What should a professional relationship with a survivor actually look like? How do we look after ourselves if we're affected? And what about legal considerations? How much detail should we be asking for? What about language? What about terminology, anonymity, all these sorts of things? And I do think that the biggest obstacle, if you like, is that we remain largely untrained in how to go about this work. It's why I run and set up the trauma reporting training, but it's also why I wrote the media tips. So you can just have a quick look that I am about to share them, but they're with the input and the insight from the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, the Ipsos psychologist, Dr. Danny Taggart, and 20 survivors so generously from On Road Media and the Angles Project, giving their insight that we could just sort of meld it all together. Should we take a look at those, Tanaka?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Okay, so it's just, you can all see that, okay? I presume you'll say if you can't. So I think one key thing is that interviewing survivors of sexual abuse, sexual violence is often profoundly traumatic. And working well with survivors isn't just about what to do and what to say, but how to be and be human. And so much of what Michelle was saying was all about being human. These offer guidance, but please ask your interviewee what works for them. So some considerations here: shame. They may feel ashamed of what happened, ashamed about people knowing. They may have been made to feel complicit. Guilt. They may feel they were at fault, to blame, could have stopped it, should have spoken out sooner. Belief. They may fear not being believed. They may have tried to disclose and not been believed. Stigma. They may feel humiliated, damaged, that people will look down on them. And fear. They may feel afraid of their abuser, afraid of breaking up their family, of public opinion. Trust. They may have been betrayed by people, by professionals, and by systems. And anger. They may feel angry with their abuser themselves or with others for not helping them. I used to see that a lot, actually, when I was interviewing people. Anxiety. It may take a huge effort to feel comfortable talking to you. They may be anxious about reactions to the piece. Just let me share this with you. It's a quote so Lou Godbold is a survivor of Harvey Weinstein. She also had her input into these to give it a sort of a US perspective. Look at that quote. It's powerful, isn't it? When you commodify us or our story, you re-traumatize us by becoming yet another abuser who exploits us. Wow. Here's what Lou has to say about why it's important, when we're working with survivors, we know what we're doing.
It's really important that journalists get this right. Not just because you run the risk of doing further harm if you run in there unprepared and unaware, but also because if you can approach the trauma survivor with empathy and give them the opportunity to tell their story in their way and in their words, then you're helping them create a coherent narrative, which is an important part of trauma recovery.
So before the interview, remember that power and control was taken from them during the assault. Enable them to take some control back. Have a think about that. Prepare. So doing your research and knowing important details will signal your level of respect. You're asking them to trust you with life-changing experiences. Offer choice. They may wish to choose the location where to sit, choose to have someone with them, choose what they want to share with you. Listen to and respect their choices. Informed consent. What's that about? Well, manage those expectations around your role and the process. Where may the material go? Who else may be in the piece? All these sorts of things. Be honest. Be careful not to jeopardize any legal proceedings, clearly. Connection. So important to treat people as individuals. And remember that abuse and trauma affect people in all sorts of ways. So make no assumptions. Survivors may feel devalued because of their experiences. Just bear in mind that talking about yourself a lot can signal that you're more important. Listen with compassion rather than talk. talking out can sometimes be a bit of a nervous thing as well. Treat them with dignity and empathy, but avoid trying to fix them or obviously being patronizing, offering solutions. Physical contact, respect their personal space. Ask permission, for example, before your crew, maybe your sound operator or your camera operator, swoops in and sticks a radio mic onto their top. Just bear these things in mind. Acknowledge that, they may well have felt nervous or tense before meeting you. So be considerate about that. Have a sit down, chat things through. Safety, this is worth just thinking about. Bear in mind, is there anything that may activate, such as shutting them in a room with you, crowding them, maybe darkening the room, blocking the exit? If they don't feel safe, they may be in survival mode and struggle to interact. And for some, and this was a really powerful addition it moved me when someone from the Angles Project to Survivor said, for some, fear can be easily triggered. So worth bearing that in mind. If you're filming anonymously, show them the shot, let them have it shoot a bit, and then let them have the look at the shot. Be careful with those distinctive features. It may be hairstyles, jewelry, clothing, the location, even maybe, church steeple out of a window can be identified. So just bear that in mind. Location, voice, offer control, chat through the possible questions. Let them know they only need to answer what they want to answer. They can stop at any time. And of course, always be clear if you're recording. Just during the interview, body language, open, unthreatening, sit at the same level. Avoid staring or being stony-faced. That can be very judgmental feeling. Avoid saying you know how they feel or what they must be going through, because you don't. Be careful with, the accusatory sounding why questions. Why didn't you just leave him? That sort of question. Or those devil's advocate questions, or some people may say, the questions that can imply disbelief. Avoid the language of blame. Be collaborative. Give them time and attention. Reflect back to show that you've understood. Remember that, trauma, it can distort thoughts and memories. So you need to allow for that if they're not answering in a chronological way necessarily. Remember, trauma is exhausting. Allow breaks. Avoid asking them to describe intimate details of their abuse. This information is personal and painful. If at any point they appear vacant or agitated, they may be reliving the traumatic event. Stay calm, pause the interview, and gently bring them back into the present moment. Now, that may be just by asking what they can see in the room, what they can hear. It's also important to pause if they become emotionally overwhelmed. Take a moment and then reestablish that they're happy to continue with the interview. And remember that they're a survivor because they've survived. Ask what helped them to get through, why they're deciding to talk to you, what their intention is, and acknowledge their identity beyond the trauma. Finally, just at the end, after the interview, obviously thank them. They've given you a great deal. Think about it. Be clear. Be honest around what happens next, with material, what happens next. Be realistic on timelines, keep them updated. Take care not to be dismissive or distracted. And I completely get, I've so been there, doing a live for lunch or a package for lunch, and you've got so much going on in your heads as you're leaving, but just be careful not to show that distraction, that being dismissive. Remember that sometimes survivors can feel a sense of pride, having spoken out truth to power, as it were, but this can be followed by overwhelming shame. So check in with them later just to ask if they're okay, which again was something that Michelle mentioned, so important. You can also offer resources and for support. Check terminology with them. Do they prefer to be referred to as a victim or a survivor, or neither? Check the facts carefully, stick to them without sensationalizing your account, and also be clear this was sexual exploitation, and try to avoid words like closure and historical. For them, it can be anything but. And just finally, as we mentioned and that Jamie mentioned earlier, these interviews can be impactful. For you as a journalist, you do need to look after yourself. Few of us escape trauma in our own lives, so just be mindful of your own vulnerabilities when you're working with survivors. And I would say, I'm going to hand over to to Jamie now, but what I would also say is after this session, after this hour, it's light night, so do get out into the fresh air just for a moment, clear your heads and talk to each other, because it's quite intensive stuff that you're listening to. Bear that in mind. So over to Jamie with the extraordinary survivors of Jo with great generosity, sharing their experience with us just to help us do our jobs better. Thank you for that.
Thanks so much, Jo. That was wonderful. And I really like the kind of what you touched on there about kind of showing that change is possible there, and talking about like how survivors have survived. I think there's something quite special about talking about how, like, modeling the change you want to see. Like, I talk about this from my own identity as a queer folk person, kind of, I really like showing that. So I think that's really, really great advice. Now, just before we lose the people that are watching at home, it's just really worth noting that if anything that you've seen today is really interesting and you'd like to know more, the Angles Project runs sessions like we're just about to go into in the live session, where we introduce you to people with direct lived experience. And the idea there is that you get a real chance to kind of not just get a kind of standard media training and briefing, but a real opportunity to ask questions, ask the difficult ones as well, and learn from people with lived experience. And as we touched upon at the beginning, that kind of work has seen incredible kind of media productions go from really good to kind of amazing top productions like Netflix's one with Jimmy Savile last week.